The chandeliers burned with a merciless brilliance, their crystal arms scattering light across the ballroom like judgment passed through glass. Silk skirts whispered over polished floors, laughter chimed with practiced ease, and the orchestra drew its bows as if nothing in the world could possibly be amiss. Yet beneath the music and perfume, beneath the careful civility of England's finest society, there lingered a cruelty so familiar it no longer startled anyone at all. Miss Eleanor Hawthorne sat alone. She occupied a chair placed politely near the wall, close enough to be visible, far enough to be forgettable. Her gloved hands rested in her lap, folded with deliberate calm, though the faint pressure of her fingers betrayed the restraint beneath. At 36, she was no novelty. She had long since ceased to inspire speculation, and instead invited something far more enduring: quiet contempt. Across the room, young ladies bloomed like fresh roses, their gowns pale and hopeful, their eyes bright with expectation. Mothers hovered with strategic smiles, fathers assessed fortunes and lineages, and every dance promised possibility. Eleanor watched it all with the practiced distance of one who knew the choreography by heart, yet would never again be asked to step upon the floor. "Poor Miss Hawthorne," murmured a voice behind a fan, not unkind enough to be accused of malice, yet sharp all the same. "Such good manners. Such unfortunate prospects." Another voice followed, softer, more amused. "One cannot deny she has perseverance. 5 seasons past her prime, and still she appears." Eleanor did not turn. She had learned long ago that dignity required stillness. To flinch was to invite further inspection. To react was to confirm the verdict already written upon her name. She kept her gaze forward, resting upon a marble column opposite her chair, and pretended it was of great interest. Her stepmother, Lady Hawthorne, stood several paces away, engaged in animated conversation with a countess whose daughter was newly betrothed. Eleanor observed how Lady Hawthorne angled her body subtly, shielding herself from association, as though proximity alone might be contagious. It was not the first time Eleanor had been left unclaimed at the edge of the room, nor would it be the last. Once, years ago, she had been invited to dance. Once, she had been admired openly, her intelligence praised, her smile remarked upon. Time, however, is a merciless editor. It revises a woman's worth with every passing season, until all that remains is a cautionary tale told in whispers. A gentleman passed her chair, hesitated, then inclined his head with polite brevity. "Good evening, Miss Hawthorne." "Good evening, sir," she replied, her voice composed, unremarkable, easily dismissed. As he moved on, Eleanor allowed herself a single, private breath. It was not loneliness that wounded most deeply, but visibility without value. She was seen, always seen, yet never chosen. The ballroom made a spectacle of abundance, and her emptiness echoed all the louder for it. From the far side of the room, a ripple of attention stirred. Conversations faltered, laughter softened, and a subtle tension wound its way through the crowd. Eleanor sensed the shift before she understood it, the way one feels a storm approach before the first thunder breaks. The great doors opened. A footman announced a name, low but commanding, and the effect was immediate. Heads turned. Spines straightened. Mothers inhaled sharply, as though bracing themselves against opportunity or danger, for with him the two were indistinguishable. The Duke of Ravenska had arrived. He entered without haste, tall and dark against the candlelight, his presence absorbing the room's attention as flame draws air. His reputation preceded him with the weight of legend. A man forged by loss, rumored to be ruthless, untethered by sentiment, and entirely indifferent to society's expectations. He had not attended a ball in years, and when he did, it was said to be for reasons no one dared question. Eleanor had seen him once before, at a distance, and had not forgotten the severity of his expression, nor the unsettling stillness with which he surveyed the world. Tonight, he wore black, unrelieved by ornament, his demeanor neither inviting nor hostile, merely final. Whispers bloomed anew, eager and speculative. Eleanor did not join in them. She watched instead as the Duke inclined his head to his host, acknowledged a greeting with minimal courtesy, and began to move through the room. Ladies angled their bodies toward him, hope sharpening their smiles. Gentlemen assessed him with wary respect. Then, inexplicably, his stride slowed. His gaze, sharp and assessing, traveled across the assembly, passing over youth and beauty without pause, until it reached the quiet edge of the room where Eleanor sat. For a moment, scarcely longer than a breath, his attention fixed upon her. Eleanor felt it like a touch. She straightened instinctively, uncertain whether she imagined the weight of that look, or whether it truly lingered. No one had ever looked at her in that way before, not with curiosity unmarred by pity, nor with interest free of calculation. Her pulse quickened, unbidden, and she lowered her eyes, chastising herself for foolishness. When she looked again, he was still watching. The orchestra resumed its melody, society exhaled, and the world appeared to continue as it always had. Yet something had shifted, delicate and dangerous, like a hairline fracture spreading beneath polished stone. Eleanor did not know why the Duke of Ravenska observed her, nor what he saw that others had long dismissed. She knew only that for the first time in many years, the loneliness that had wrapped itself so tightly around her seemed to loosen, if only by a thread. And as the Duke turned, at last, and began to walk in her direction, the whispers behind fans took on a sharper edge, sensing, perhaps, that mockery had summoned something far more formidable than it ever intended. The night held its breath, aware that a reckoning approached, and Eleanor Hawthorne stood unknowingly at its center alone. The Duke of Ravenska crossed the ballroom with the unhurried certainty of a man accustomed to silence following his steps. Conversations bent around him, voices lowering as though sound itself deferred to his presence. Eleanor felt the air shift as he drew nearer, a subtle pressure settling upon her chest, not fear, but the disquiet of being noticed after years of neglect. She remained seated, spine straight, chin lifted, her composure a shield she had long perfected. He stopped before her chair. For a breathless moment, the world narrowed to the space between them. Candlelight caught the angles of his face, severe and composed, revealing eyes the color of storm-darkened steel. They were not unkind eyes, she observed, but relentless, as though truth, once found, would not be released. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, her name spoken with measured precision, neither softened nor sharpened by judgment. She rose at once, the movement instinctive, her skirts whispering as she inclined her head. "Your Grace." A flicker of something passed through his expression, too swift to name, yet unmistakably attentive. He gestured toward her chair. "May I?" The simplicity of the request struck her more forcefully than any grand declaration. She nodded, stepping aside as he took the adjacent seat, an act so audacious in its ordinariness that it rippled through the room like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor felt eyes upon her from every direction. Curiosity sharpened into scrutiny. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion," he continued, his voice low enough to exclude the surrounding crowd. "But it appeared to me that you were in need of company." She met his gaze then, surprised by the absence of condescension. "Company is a rare commodity, Your Grace," she replied softly. "One learns not to expect it." "Expectation," he said, studying her face, "is a luxury afforded to those who have never been disappointed." The remark settled between them, intimate in its understanding. Before she could respond, a footman approached, bearing a crystal goblet filled with red wine. The Duke accepted it without looking away from her and placed it into Eleanor's hand. A murmur rose instantly, the sound of scandal being born. Her fingers trembled despite her effort to steady them. "This is most improper," she murmured, aware of every watchful glance. His mouth curved faintly, not quite a smile. "Impropriety is merely propriety observed too closely." She should have refused. Every lesson impressed upon her since girlhood urged retreat, discretion, invisibility. Yet something in his calm defiance emboldened her, and she lifted the glass in silent acknowledgment. The act, small as it was, sealed her fate for the evening. Lady Hawthorne turned at last, her expression stiff with disbelief. Eleanor felt the familiar weight of reproach settle upon her shoulders, but it was eclipsed by the Duke's presence beside her, immovable and unrepentant. "Tell me," he said, as the orchestra struck a livelier tune, "do you dance, Miss Hawthorne?" The question, so plainly asked, struck her breathless. "I once did," she answered carefully. "Once," he repeated, as though tasting the word. He rose, extending his hand. "Then indulge me now." The ballroom seemed to tilt. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears, each beat echoing with warning. Acceptance would brand her reckless. Refusal would confirm every whispered assumption of insignificance. She hesitated, the span of a heartbeat stretched unbearably long. Then she placed her hand in his. Gasps fluttered across the room like startled birds. The Duke drew her gently into the center of the floor, his hand firm at her back, his posture signaling possession without force. As they began to move, Eleanor became acutely aware of the nearness of him, the measured control with which he guided her, never domineering, always precise. "You are watching the room as though it might strike," he observed. "It often does," she replied. "Then allow me to stand between you and its teeth." Her steps faltered at the words, and he adjusted seamlessly, steadying her without remark. Around them, couples danced with polished smiles, but Eleanor sensed that they alone occupied the true center of attention. Whispers followed their passage, threads of speculation weaving rapidly into rumor. When the music ended, applause broke out, scattered yet fervent. The Duke inclined his head, escorting her from the floor with the same deliberate composure. Before he could speak again, a young woman stepped forward, her smile brittle, her eyes sharp with challenge. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head, "I had not realized you favored charity." The insult struck its mark, clean and cruel. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, humiliation pressing in like a closing fist. She began to withdraw her hand, but the Duke's grip tightened, imperceptibly, yet decisively. "I do not," he replied, his tone mild and deadly. "I favor discernment." Silence fell, heavy and charged. The young woman flushed, retreating beneath his gaze. Eleanor stared at him, stunned by the ease with which he had dismantled the attack. "Come," he said, guiding her toward the terrace doors. "You have endured enough for one evening." Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the scent of rain and distant flowers. The noise of the ballroom faded behind them, replaced by a quieter tension, more intimate, more dangerous. "You will be spoken of tomorrow," Eleanor said, not accusing, merely stating fact. "Yes," he agreed. "And so will I." He turned to face her fully, his expression grave. "They have spoken of you for years without consequence. Let them speak now with reason." She searched his face, seeking motive, deception, amusement, and found none of it. Instead, there was resolve unyielding. Before she could question him further, voices drifted toward the terrace, inquisitive and eager. The Duke's gaze flicked toward the sound, then returned to her, intent and unreadable. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "this evening is not finished with you." And as the doors behind them creaked open, Eleanor understood that whatever protection he offered came at a cost she had not yet measured. The terrace lay hushed beneath a veil of night, the lanterns casting trembling halos upon stone dampened by recent rain. Eleanor stood near the balustrade, fingers resting upon the cool marble, aware of the Duke's presence behind her as one is aware of a gathering storm. Inside, the murmur of the ballroom persisted, but here the air felt thinner, charged with the promise of candor and consequence. "I should return," she said at last, though she made no move to do so. "My absence will only encourage speculation." "Speculation thrives regardless," he replied. "It is fed by silence as readily as by scandal." She turned then, meeting his gaze beneath the lantern glow. "You intervened without invitation, Your Grace. I cannot imagine why." He regarded her steadily. "Because I recognized something familiar." Her brow furrowed. "In me. In the manner you endure," he said. "It is a skill learned through long acquaintance with disregard." The words loosened something carefully knotted within her. She drew a measured breath. "Endurance is not admirable," she said quietly. "It is merely necessary when escape is denied." He stepped closer, though he left a respectful distance between them. "You believe yourself trapped." "I am," she answered without hesitation. "By years, by rumor, by a narrative I did not author and cannot revise. Tonight was meant to remind me of that." His jaw tightened. "Instead, it reminded me why I avoid rooms such as that." She studied him, struck by the faint bitterness beneath his composure. "You possess power beyond imagining," she said. "Surely you are not wounded by whispered judgments." "They are not whispers when spoken by those who claim dominion over your worth," he replied. "I was measured once, Miss Hawthorne, and found wanting by standards I refused to honor. Since then, I have made it my habit to stand apart." Rain began to fall in earnest, a soft percussion against stone. Eleanor remained still, the chill sharpening her thoughts. "Then why step back into their midst now?" "Because I saw you standing alone," he said simply. "And I recognized the cost of isolation." The honesty of it disarmed her. She laughed softly, without mirth. "You mistake me for braver than I am. I have grown accustomed to solitude. It asks little and demands nothing." "Solitude," he said, "is a luxury when chosen. When imposed, it becomes a sentence." Her throat tightened. Memories pressed forward, seasons of polite dismissal, conversations ending when she approached, invitations ceasing altogether. "They taught me to be quiet," she admitted. "To take up as little space as possible, lest I offend by existing beyond my usefulness." "That is a lie society tells to preserve its comfort," he said. "It fears those who cannot be easily catalogued." She searched his face, seeking irony, finding none. "You speak as though you know me." "I know restraint," he replied. "I know what it is to be observed and never understood." The rain blurred the lantern light, casting shifting shadows across his features. For a moment, she imagined what lay beneath the reserve, scars unseen, grief unspoken. The thought stirred an unexpected tenderness. "You embarrassed me," she said gently. His eyes flickered. "That was not my intent." "No," she agreed. "You defended me. And in doing so, you made me visible." He inclined his head. "Visibility is dangerous." "Yes," she said. "And intoxicating." Silence stretched between them, filled only by rain and distant music. Eleanor felt a pull she did not trust, a hope she had long since buried stirring uneasily. "You must understand," she said at last, "that any association with me invites ridicule. I have nothing to offer in exchange for your consideration." He took a step nearer, his voice lowering. "You offer truth. It is rarer than beauty and far more costly." Her breath caught. "Why does that matter to you?" "Because I am weary of illusions," he said. "And because tonight, you reminded me of who I was before I learned to harden myself." The admission struck deep, resonant. She felt suddenly seen in a way that frightened her. "Then do not mistake gratitude for devotion," she warned. "I cannot be the instrument of your redemption." His mouth curved, restrained yet earnest. "Nor do I ask it. I ask only that you do not diminish yourself to spare others discomfort." Footsteps sounded beyond the terrace, voices approaching, sharpened by curiosity. Eleanor stiffened, instinct urging retreat. The Duke offered his arm, not insistently, but as an invitation. "Whatever follows," he said, "will alter the course of this evening. Perhaps more." She hesitated, weighing caution against a stirring resolve she scarcely recognized. As she placed her hand upon his sleeve, she knew that the quiet endurance which had defined her life was giving way to something far more perilous, and far more alive. They stepped back toward the doors together, the rain easing as though the night itself listened. Eleanor felt the weight of watching eyes even before they re-entered the light, yet her stride no longer sought concealment. Something within her had shifted, subtle yet irreversible, like a compass needle disturbed. She wondered whether courage was always so quiet at its birth, or whether it only seemed so because fear had long occupied its place. Beside her, the Duke's presence was steady, neither possessive nor distant, and offered certainty she had not known she desired. As the music swelled again, she sensed that the story whispered about her would no longer be written solely by others. Still, uncertainty pressed close, for protection from one powerful man could invite the enmity of many. When the doors opened and sound poured over them, Eleanor lifted her chin, prepared to meet the consequence of choice. Yet as she crossed the threshold, she felt his hand tighten briefly upon her arm, a silent vow or warning she could not yet distinguish, and she understood that whatever path lay ahead would demand more than endurance. It would require belief, and the courage to be claimed. The ballroom received them with a hush that felt deliberate, as though the crowd itself leaned forward to witness the consequence of their return. Eleanor sensed the scrutiny immediately, sharper now, honed by absence and conjecture. Faces turned, fans stilled, and even the musicians faltered before recovering their rhythm. She released the Duke's arm, instinct urging distance, yet the space between them seemed charged, impossible to neutralize. Lady Hawthorne approached at once, her smile strained thin as spun glass. "Eleanor," she murmured, the rebuke contained within the softness of her tone. "You have been missed." "I am certain," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath. The Duke inclined his head to Lady Hawthorne with impeccable courtesy. "I required Miss Hawthorne's counsel," he said. "I trust you will forgive the delay." Lady Hawthorne stiffened, and used to explanation offered without apology. "Of course, Your Grace." They moved deeper into the room together, and the whispers resumed, emboldened. Eleanor caught fragments as they passed. Speculation sharpened into accusation, admiration twisted into suspicion. She felt the familiar urge to shrink, to make herself smaller beneath the collective gaze, yet resisted it with conscious effort. A gentleman's laugh rose too loudly near the orchestra. "Remarkable," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Some women bloom late, it seems. Or perhaps desperation has finally found a patron." Heat surged through Eleanor, humiliation swift and searing. She halted, every instinct urging retreat. Before she could speak, the Duke stopped as well. He turned, his expression composed, his voice carrying with effortless authority. "Sir," he said, "you mistake novelty for value. A common error among those who lack discernment." The gentleman flushed, stammering, and withdrew amid muffled murmurs. The silence that followed was not empty but expectant, as though society itself awaited the next blow. Eleanor stared at the Duke, shaken by the finality of his defense. "You need not do this," she said quietly. "I am accustomed to bearing such remarks." "That," he replied, "is precisely why I will not permit them." The word struck like a bell, resonant and irrevocable. Attention converged upon them from every corner of the room, curiosity eclipsing decorum. Eleanor felt herself at the center of a spectacle she had neither sought nor controlled. Music swelled again, but the rhythm could not disguise the tension coiling through the air. The Duke extended his hand once more. "Dance with me," he said, not as a request, but an invitation laden with consequence. She hesitated, her heart a wild percussion. To accept would seal her defiance. To refuse would fracture the fragile courage she had begun to claim. She placed her hand in his, and the floor seemed to fall away beneath her feet. They moved together with measured grace, every step deliberate. Eleanor became acutely aware of the strength at his back, the unwavering certainty with which he guided her. Around them, conversation dissolved into a low hum, spectators drawn helplessly to the unfolding drama. As the dance drew to a close, the Duke did not release her. Instead, he turned to face the assembly, his hand still resting at her waist. The gesture alone was scandal enough, yet he did not flinch beneath the weight of their attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm, commanding, "it has come to my attention that Miss Eleanor Hawthorne has been the subject of prolonged unkindness." A ripple passed through the crowd, discomfort and anticipation entwined. Eleanor's breath caught, fear and astonishment warring within her. "I find such treatment," he continued, "both unjust and unworthy of this society's pretensions." Lady Hawthorne gasped softly. Others exchanged glances, uncertain whether to intervene or retreat. The Duke's gaze swept the room, unyielding. "Miss Hawthorne possesses integrity, intelligence, and fortitude in greater measure than many who would presume to judge her. If these qualities render her unsuitable, then the fault lies not with her." Eleanor felt tears threaten, unsummoned and unwelcome. She lifted her chin, refusing to bow beneath their pity or their shock. "I will be plain," the Duke said, tightening his hold by a fraction. "I intend to court Miss Hawthorne with the full expectation of marriage." The declaration fell like thunder. Voices rose at once, some incredulous, others outraged. Eleanor's vision blurred. her senses overwhelmed by the enormity of his claim. She turned to him, searching his face for doubt or calculation, and found only resolve. "You cannot be serious," Lady Hawthorne whispered, stepping forward. "Your Grace, consider." "I have," he replied. "At length." He turned back to Eleanor, his expression softening. "You need not answer now," he said quietly. "Nor ever, if you choose otherwise. But I will not allow your worth to be debated as though it were currency." The room seemed to recede, leaving only the space between them. Eleanor felt the weight of years pressing upon her, of choices denied and silence endured. This moment demanded something of her she had never before been asked to give, herself. She drew a steadying breath. "Your Grace," she said, her voice clear despite the tremor in her hands, "you honor me beyond measure. Yet you place me in peril." "Then I will stand with you in it," he replied without hesitation. The simplicity of the promise unraveled her defenses. She looked out at the assembled faces, at the judgment she had feared all her life, and found that it no longer held the same power. "I will not hide," she said softly. "Not again." A murmur swept the room, uncertain, unsettled. Eleanor felt something shift irrevocably within her, a reclaiming of ground long surrendered. Yet even as resolve steadied her, doubt lingered, sharp and persistent. For in claiming her so boldly, the Duke had challenged more than gossip. He had challenged an order that rarely forgave defiance. And as the music faltered once more, Eleanor understood that this declaration was not an ending, but a beginning fraught with consequence neither of them could yet foresee. The night watched, breathlessly waiting. Eleanor slept little that night, not for lack of weariness, but because her mind refused rest. Dawn found her seated by the window, watching pale light creep across the rooftops, carrying with it the irrevocable knowledge that her life had shifted beyond return. By mid-morning the household stirred with uneasy purpose, servants whispering more than usual, doors opening and closing with restrained urgency. London had awakened hungry, and her name would feed it. The Duke of Ravenska arrived before noon. He did not announce himself with flourish, nor did he bring gifts meant to placate or impress. He came alone, his expression grave, his bearing resolute. Eleanor received him in the small drawing-room, a space chosen deliberately for its simplicity. Sunlight fell through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like suspended breath. "I wished to see you before the city reshaped last night to suit itself," he said. "You have already reshaped it," Eleanor replied. Her voice was calm, though her heart thudded painfully. "They will not forgive such disruption." "I did not act to earn forgiveness," he said. "Only truth." She studied him, searching again for regret and finding none. "You placed my fate upon your own terms." "I offered you choice," he answered. "I still do." The words settled heavily between them. Eleanor folded her hands, grounding herself in the familiar discipline of composure. "I must ask what you expect of me, Your Grace. Not in rumor, but in reality." He considered her carefully. "I expect nothing you do not willingly give. I offer my name, my protection, and my intention. Society may interpret that as conquest. I do not." Silence stretched, fragile yet charged. Eleanor rose and crossed to the window, her reflection faint against the glass. "For years," she said softly, "I have lived as though I were already finished. You ask me now to begin again beneath a gaze that has never been kind. I ask you to begin as yourself," he replied. "Unhidden." She turned back to him, courage and fear braided tightly together. "And if I cannot bear it, then I will bear it with you," he said. A carriage arrived that afternoon, summoned not by whim but by design. The Duke offered his arm as they stepped into the street together, unmasked, unashamed. Neighbors watched from windows, curiosity blooming into astonishment. Eleanor felt the weight of every stare, yet she did not falter. They drove beyond the city's dense clamor, toward a small church set apart by ancient trees. It was not grand, nor fashionable, but it possessed a quiet dignity that soothed Eleanor's nerves. Inside, the air smelled faintly of stone and old hymns. There was no audience save the vicar and two witnesses, neither chosen for rank. The Duke stood beside her, his presence steady, his vow spoken without flourish yet with unmistakable conviction. Eleanor's voice trembled only once, then steadied as she spoke words she had never imagined would be hers. When the final blessing was given, the silence that followed felt sacred rather than empty. The Duke turned to her, no longer guarded, no longer distant. He kissed her then, not with spectacle but with reverence, a promise sealed quietly yet irrevocably. News traveled faster than they did. By evening, London buzzed with disbelief, outrage, reluctant admiration. Some called it folly, others strategy. Few called it love. Eleanor listened without flinching, her sense of self no longer contingent upon consensus. At Ravenska House, firelight warmed the great hall as servants moved with renewed purpose. Eleanor paused at the threshold, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what she had entered. The Duke noticed her hesitation. "You may still turn back," he said gently. She smiled then, a small, resolute curve of her lips. "I have been turning back all my life." Days passed, then weeks. Society adjusted, as it always did, reshaping scandal into history. Invitations arrived again, cautious at first, then eager. Eleanor chose carefully which to accept, no longer driven by hunger for approval. One evening, as she stood beside her husband at a candlelit gathering, she overheard a familiar whisper. "She was mocked once," a woman murmured, "but see how she stands now." Eleanor met the speaker's gaze, unashamed, unbowed. She realized then that dignity, once reclaimed, could not easily be stripped away. Later, alone with the Duke in the quiet of their shared chamber, she rested her head against his shoulder. "They mocked me for standing alone," she said. He pressed a kiss to her hair. "They mistook solitude for weakness." Outside, rain began to fall, gentle and steady, washing the city clean. Eleanor closed her eyes, knowing the world would continue to test her resolve. Yet for the first time, she faced that future not as a woman waiting to be chosen, but as one who had claimed her place, and in doing so, had taught even the most dangerous Duke the courage of love. The marriage did not soften him in the ways gossip predicted, nor did it diminish her. Instead, they learned each other slowly, through glances exchanged across crowded rooms and conversations held late when the world demanded nothing further. He listened when she spoke, truly listened, and she discovered that her thoughts, once dismissed, carried weight here. In time, even those who had scoffed were forced to acknowledge the transformation, not of her station, but of her presence. She moved through rooms with quiet authority, not borrowed from his title, but born of self-recognition. And when doubt returned, as it sometimes did in the small hours, she reminded herself that endurance had carried her this far, but choice had carried her home. The future remained unwritten, full of trials neither could yet name, but Eleanor no longer feared its blank pages. She had stepped into them willingly, hand in hand with a man who had seen her when the world refused to, and that knowledge would sustain her through whatever storm society still dared to send. At last.